15 days. A dramatic narrative narrated in the first person by Elise Arnaud. Part 1, the countdown begins. The number appeared in my mind on New Year's Eve. Not a thought exactly, more like a fact the body already knew and was finally allowing the mind to receive. A precise and merciless figure, 15 days, 23 hours, 41 minutes, and some number of seconds that were already passing as I stood on the steps of our house in Lyon and watched the snow fall on the Quai de Sonny. I had just come from the hospital, from Dr. Lebrun's office on the 4th floor, where the walls are the colour of an old envelope, and there is a plant in the corner that looks as though no one has ever watered it. He had shown me the scans. I am a graphic designer by training, and I know how to read images, how to understand what spatial relationships communicate, how to extract information from a composition. The scans did not require much interpretation. The white masses in the grey of the image told a story that was specific and complete and did not have an alternative reading. I had asked him how long. He had not wanted to answer this directly, as doctors do not want to answer this directly because the directness is a weight they do not entirely wish to carry. I had told him I preferred the direct version. He had told me. I had thanked him and put on my coat and walked to the car and driven home along the river. And somewhere between the hospital and the house, the number had appeared. 15 days. I stood on the steps in the New Year's Eve snow and looked at the house where my husband was inside, waiting for me to return from wherever I had told him I was going. I had not told him the truth about where I was going. I had not told him a great many things in the months since October, when the headaches became something different from ordinary headaches, when the nosebleeds began, when the specific quality of my vision started its slow and merciless deterioration. I had not told him because I had been trying to find the right time, and then because I had understood that there was not going to be a right time, and finally because of what I had heard the previous Tuesday. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who we were before I tell you what happened to us. Part 2, 10 years. My name is Elise Arnaud. I was 24 when I married Lucien Vidal. We had known each other since we were children, which is a fact that people say romantically, as though childhood friendship is inherently the foundation of enduring love, but which in our case was simply a geographical fact. His family and mine had lived in the same quartier of Lyon for 3 generations. We had attended the same school. We had been for most of our growing up simply neighbours who knew each other with the specific, unexamined familiarity of people who share a landscape. I fell in love with him when I was 20, not gradually, in the specific way that a feeling you have always had but not understood finally becomes visible to you, arriving not as a new thing but as the recognition of something old. He was not different at 22 than he had been at 12, but I was different at 20 than I had been at 12, and the difference was understanding. I told him. I was 22 by then, 2 years of carrying it, and I told him in the specific direct way that I have always addressed difficult things, because I have never been good at the management of indirect approaches. I told him I was in love with him. He listened to me tell him this with the careful attention he brought to everything, and then he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I know." That was the first moment I understood what the next 10 years would be. Not the years themselves, not the specific shape of them, but the fundamental thing. He knew, he had always known. He had received my love and held it the way you hold something that belongs to someone else with care, but without the claim of the person it belongs to. We married anyway. This sounds like a greater act of irrationality than it actually was. We married within the context of a specific and practical arrangement that was also in the private layer, beneath the practicality, an act of hope on my part. The arrangement was this: his business, which was in commercial real estate, was in a critical period of expansion that required capital his family did not have. My family did. The marriage was presented to the world as a love match, which I allowed because I believed at 24 that love in sufficient quantity and patience could become reciprocal, that the familiar could warm into something else over time, that he would eventually see what was in front of him. I gave him 10 years. I gave him 10 years of the specific daily love that does not announce itself, the love that is present in meals and small considerations, and the specific attentiveness of a person who has organized their life around someone else's comfort and well-being. I learned what he preferred for breakfast and what made him sleep badly, and what he needed after a difficult day, and what kinds of music helped him think. I ran the house with the focused care of a person who understands that the maintenance of a home is a form of love, whether or not it is recognized as one. He was not unkind to me. I want to say this clearly because what happened is not a story of cruelty. Cruelty would have been in some ways simpler. What Lucien was to me was not cruel. He was absent. Not physically, he was in the house, often. He came home for dinner when he said he would, and he fulfilled the practical obligations of a husband with the precise reliability of someone who understands obligation and honors it. But he was absent in the specific way that a person is absent when they are present in a space but not present in the relationship. The attention was elsewhere. The interior life was elsewhere. I had understood this for years. I had understood it and chosen over and over to continue in the hope that the elsewhere would eventually become here. I had been a fool of the specific kind that loves too much and waits too long, and believes in the transformation of a person who has shown no indication of transforming. This is not an uncommon kind of fool, but it was the kind I was. The third person in this story is someone named Camille Laurent. I will tell you about her in the appropriate place. What I will tell you now is that by the time I understood she existed in his life in the way she existed, I had already understood. From the hospital on the 4th floor and the scans and Dr. Lebrun's careful face that I had 15 days. Part 3, what I heard. 4 days before the number appeared in my head, I had come home early from a client meeting that ended sooner than expected. The house was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet, when they contain fewer people than they appear to, but not empty. I came through the front door and heard from the study Lucien's voice. He was on the phone. He speaks on the phone with the specific low quality of someone who is accustomed to keeping professional matters contained. But this was not the professional tone. This was something warmer and more private, the tone of a person speaking to someone whose company they actually want. I stood in the entrance hall and held my coat in my hands and listened to the part I could hear. He said, "I know it is complicated." He said, "I think about you." He said after a pause, "Yes, that too." I hung my coat on the hook and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. I had suspected something for months. The suspicion had arrived in the specific way that knowledge you are not ready to receive arrives gradually through accumulated small evidences, each one individually dismissible, and all of them together forming a picture you cannot continue to look away from. The later evenings. The phone left in his jacket pocket. The quality of a specific silence when certain names came up in conversation. Camille Laurent was a colleague, a property consultant, who had come into his orbit through a joint project 6 months earlier. I had met her twice at professional dinners. I had attended as his wife, and she had been everything that people who are not threatening are supposed to be in those situations. Pleasant and professional and without any obvious signal. I was not angry sitting on the edge of the bed. I want to be honest about this. I had been angry before, in the months of suspicion, the specific hot anger of someone who is being deceived and knows it, but cannot name it. What I felt sitting on the edge of the bed was something cooler and more final. The specific emotional state of a person who has just had a suspicion confirmed, and who understands that confirmation means there are now decisions to make. 3 days later, I went to the hospital for the results of the most recent scan. Dr. Lebrun showed me the images and told me what I have already told you. And then the number appeared. 15 days. I stood on the steps on New Year's Eve in the snow, and I held both of these facts at the same time, which is one of the stranger things I have done. The fact of him and Camille Laurent, the fact of the number. And I understood standing in the snow that I was not going to spend 15 days in the management of the first fact. I went inside. I said hello and asked if he was hungry. He said yes, and I made dinner and we sat at the table, and the snow fell outside and the lion bells rang in the new year at midnight. And I held the number in my head and said nothing. Part 4, Day 15. On the morning of Day 15, I called my best friend Margot. Margot has been my closest friend since we were 11 years old. She is the person who knows the most about me in the world, more than my mother, more certainly than Lucien, because she has been paying attention for 20 years with the specific tenacity of a person who is genuinely interested in the interior lives of the people she loves. She is a pediatric nurse in Grenoble. She is practical and direct, and she does not soften things, which is one of the reasons I have always trusted her. I called her at 8 in the morning, which she knew meant something serious, because I do not make calls before 9 unless something is serious. She picked up on the first ring. I said, Margot, I need to tell you something and I need you to listen without interrupting. She said, I am listening. I told her everything. The hospital in October, the progression of the diagnosis, Dr. Lebrun, the number, all of it. I spoke for 12 minutes without stopping, which is unusual for me because I am not generally a person who speaks for 12 continuous minutes. When I finished, there was a silence, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the specific silence of someone absorbing something too large to respond to immediately. Then she said, I am getting in my car. I said, Margot, Grenoble is 2 hours. She said, I know how far Grenoble is. She arrived at 11. She came through the door and looked at me for a moment in the specific way that a person looks at someone they love when they have been told something terrible, the look that contains grief and love, and the specific effort of not breaking in front of the person who needs them to not break. Then she hugged me, very tightly, for a long time. She said into my hair, you should have told me in October. I said, I know. I was not ready to make it real. She said it was real whether you made it real or not. I said, I know. We sat in the kitchen and she made coffee and I told her the rest of it. Lucien, Camille Laurent, the specific decision I had made standing in the snow on New Year's Eve. She said, what is the decision? I said, not to tell him about the illness, to let him go to his life without carrying the weight of this. Margot looked at me for a long time. She said, you are protecting him. I said, I am protecting myself. I do not want his guilt or his pity. I do not want the last 15 days of my life to be about managing Lucien Vidal's feelings about how he treated me. She said, that is honest. I said, it is the only frame I have that is mine. She nodded. She drank her coffee. She said, what do you need? I said, I need you to know. I need one person to know and to be here. She said, I am here. That was day 15. Margot was there for the rest of it. She took leave from the hospital and she stayed, and there is no way to express what that meant, because some forms of love cannot be adequately described. They can only be received. Part 5, the divorce papers. I presented Lucien with the divorce papers on day 13. I had prepared them the previous week in the hours when he was at the office with the help of a solicitor Margot had found for me, someone efficient and discreet, who understood that the timeline required efficiency. The papers were thorough and fair. I had not taken anything I was not entitled to, and had made no claims that required argument. The specific architecture of my settlement was designed to close as quickly as possible. He came down to breakfast on day 13, and I placed the folder on the table beside his coffee. He opened it. He read. The specific quality of his stillness as he read was something I watched with the detached attention of someone who has moved past the stage of needing a particular response. He looked up. His face was doing something complicated. Not guilt exactly. Surprise was part of it, the surprise of someone who has been living in a particular configuration of the world and has just been told it is different from what they believed. Also something else, an expression I had not seen on him before, the expression of a person encountering the edges of something they have not fully examined. He said, Elise, I said, I think we both know this is the right thing. I would like to do it as quickly and as calmly as possible. He said, "Can we talk about this?" I said, "We can talk about the practical elements. The terms are fair. The solicitor will explain anything that needs explaining." He said, "That is not what I mean." I looked at him across the table in the morning light of our kitchen in Lyon, with the coffee going cold between us. I looked at him the way you look at something you have been looking at for 10 years, but have decided finally to see clearly. I said, "Lucien, I know about Camille." The room was very quiet. He said, "Elise?" I said, "I do not want to discuss it. I am not interested in an explanation or an apology. I am telling you I know so that we can have this conversation in its complete form, rather than its partial form." He was very still. I said, "Please read the papers and contact my solicitor. She is efficient and I believe we can conclude this quickly." I picked up my coffee and went to the other room, and that was the last serious conversation Lucien and I had in that house. He signed on day 10. The civil procedure in France requires a brief waiting period, some administrative steps, but the process was moving, and it was moving in the direction I needed it to move. Margot came with me to the Civil Affairs office on day 7 and stood beside me while the registrar processed the documents and handed me the certificate of divorce, which was a small piece of paper that contained on its surface only administrative fact, and beneath its surface everything I was feeling but had decided not to perform. I held the certificate in my hands for a moment outside the Civil Affairs office. The January cold was particular that day, the kind that gets into the bones without announcing itself. Margot stood beside me. I said, "It is official." She said, "Yes." I said, "I thought I would feel something larger." She said, "What do you feel?" I said, "A very specific kind of tired, the kind that means something heavy has been set down." She said, "That is allowed." We walked to the cafe on the corner and had coffee and did not talk about any of it. We talked about her nephew in Grenoble, who was 4 years old and had recently decided that the correct response to every question was a question in return, which Margot described with the affectionate exasperation of someone who finds this both exhausting and delightful. I laughed. The laugh was real. That was day 7. Part 6, the wedding dress. On day 6, I went to a bridal shop on the Rue de la République. I want to explain this because without explanation it may seem like the act of a person who has lost their practical mind, which I had not. It was a specific and deliberate thing arrived at through a specific and deliberate line of thinking that I am going to describe as honestly as I can. Lucien and I had married in a civil ceremony at the town hall, which was all that was possible at the time because his business was in a critical period and the money was needed elsewhere. I had understood and accepted this without complaint. The understanding had been genuine, but beneath the genuine understanding there had also been quietly and without much examination a small unopened space. The space that contained the wedding I had imagined when I was small, the specific ceremony of a woman publicly chosen and celebrated, the specific garment that means a thing about the day and about the person wearing it. I had never said this to anyone. It had seemed over 10 years like the kind of want that would resolve itself or diminish or simply become irrelevant. It had not become irrelevant. On day 6, I walked into the bridal shop on the Rue de la République, and a young woman with dark hair came forward and asked if she could help me. I told her I was not looking for something for a wedding. She looked at me with the polite confusion of someone who is in a bridal shop and cannot immediately pass why a person not looking for wedding things would be here. I said I would like to try on a dress, just to try, and perhaps to take a photograph. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Of course." She showed me the dresses. I chose one immediately, without the hesitation that I think she was accustomed to with customers who take time to decide. I chose it because it was the one that looked on the hanger like something that would look right on me, rather than something that would look like the idea of a wedding dress. Long and simple with a particular quality of fabric that moved well, ivory rather than white. In the changing room I put it on and stood in front of the mirror. The woman in the mirror was not the version of me that I had been looking at for years, the practical, efficient, slightly diminished version that had been running through 10 years of a marriage to a man who was absent. she was someone else, or she was me, but more completely me, the version of myself that existed without the accumulated cost of the 10 years and the illness and the countdown. I took photographs, not for anyone else, for myself, the specific record of a version of myself that I wanted to exist somewhere. When I came out of the changing room, the sales assistant looked at me with an expression that I recognized as something genuine. She said, "You look beautiful." I said, "Thank you." I said it and I meant it because for the first time in a very long time, I felt that the beautiful was not something I was performing, but something I was, and the feeling of it was its own form of gift. I paid for a set of prints at the photography place next door, and I walked home with them under my arm, and I left them on the kitchen table for Margot to find when she came in from her walk. She found them. She came into the room where I was sitting and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "These are you." I said, "Yes." She said, "You are very beautiful in them." I said, "I know." She sat down beside me. She took my hand. We sat in the afternoon light with the photographs on the table and the lion winter doing its particular thing outside the window. And it was one of the better hours of those 15 days. Part 7, what Lucien came to say. On day 5, Lucien came to my mother's house. I had been staying with my mother since day 8, since the house in the 16th began to feel like too much space for a person who was becoming smaller. My mother is 63. She has lived alone since my father died 4 years ago, and she has done this with the specific self-sufficient dignity of a woman who has always known her own dimensions. She had not asked unnecessary questions when I arrived with my bag. She had simply made up the room and put flowers in it the way she does, and said, "Stay as long as you need." She knew I was ill. I had told her on day 12, the day after I told Margot. She had held my face in her hands for a moment and looked at me very carefully the way she used to look at me when I was small and had hurt myself, and she needed to assess the extent of it. Then she had put her hands down and said, "All right, we will do this together." She was the specific form of strength that does not announce itself. The strength that makes soup and changes bed linens and sits beside you at 11 at night when you cannot sleep, and talks about ordinary things until the inability to sleep becomes sleep. She did not weep in front of me. She wept when she thought I was sleeping and I could hear her through the wall. And the sound of my mother crying quietly was one of the harder things. On day 5, Lucien appeared at the door. My mother let him in. I came down from the room and we sat in the small sitting room where my parents' furniture has been for as long as I can remember the specific and unchanging geography of a family home. He looked as he always looked when something had moved outside his control, slightly diminished. The particular quality of a man who manages things and who has encountered something that cannot be managed. His eyes had shadows in them that I had not seen before. He said, "Elise, I need to understand what happened." I said, "What happened is that I asked for a divorce and you agreed to it." He said, "That is not what I mean." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, I feel like something is happening that I do not know about. You seem different." I looked at him. The man I had loved for 10 years, who had received that love without returning it, who had given 10 years of his attention to everything except what was in front of him. The man who had been kind to me in the way that kind people are kind, when kindness costs nothing, who had failed me in the way that people fail when they have not learned to look. I said, "Lucien, what do you think is happening?" He said, "I think you are not well." I said, "I am tired." He said, "Elise?" I said, "I am tired from a long time of being in a situation that was not right. I am simplifying my life. That is what is happening." He sat with this. He was a man who was accustomed to reading situations accurately. It was one of his professional skills. And he was reading this one with the specific intensity of someone who senses that the reading is incomplete. But I had become in those days very good at presenting only what I chose to present. The 15 days had clarified certain things about what I was willing to give. He said, "Camille and I are not what you think." I said, "Lucien, the divorce papers are signed. This conversation does not need to happen." He said, "I want you to know the truth." I said, "I am sure the truth is complicated and feels important to you. I am not interested in it right now. I am interested in being in my mother's house and being left to the things I need to attend to. He looked at me for a long time. The expression on his face was one I was trying not to look at too directly, because looking at it directly would have cost me something I could not afford. It was the expression of a man who is beginning to understand something he has arrived at too late. He said, "Will you call me if you need anything?" I said, "I will." He stood up. At the door he paused. He said with his back to me the way people say things they cannot say. "While looking at you, I am sorry, Elise. For what it is worth, for all of it." I said, "I know." He left. I sat in my parents' furniture for a while and then I went back upstairs. Part 8, My Mother. I want to tell you about my mother before the days run out, because she is the center of this story in a way that I have not yet fully described, and that deserves description. Her name is Adeline Arnaud. She was born in Lyon in 1960, the daughter of a fabric merchant and a seamstress, and she grew up understanding that everything beautiful is made from specific and patient labor, that cloth becomes a dress through the application of skill and time and attention. She applied this understanding to everything in her life, including the raising of me, which she did with a precision and a warmth that I understand more clearly now from the vantage point of having 15 days than I understood when I was inside it. She met my father at 22. He died when I was 28. She grieved him for 2 years in the specific and thorough way she does everything, and then she resumed her life, which continued to be organized, beautiful, and precisely maintained. She had known about the marriage, not the details, not the specific interior landscape of 10 years with a man who was elsewhere, but the shape of it. She had known because she is a person who has been paying attention to me for 34 years, and whose attention, unlike Lucian's, has never been elsewhere. She had not said much about the marriage, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that there are times when the role of a parent is to hold space rather than fill it. On day 3, she pushed me in a wheelchair to the hospital garden. The garden in winter is not a garden in the way that the word suggests warmth and growth. It is a space that has the structure of a garden, the paths and the bare trees and the beds that will be something in spring and in January. It is all skeleton and pale light. We sat in the pale light, my mother behind me with her hands on the wheelchair handles, and the cold came through my coat in a way that I was too tired to resist. I said, "Maman, I am cold." She came around to the front of the wheelchair and sat in the chair they keep there for visitors, and she opened her coat and wrapped the panels of it around me as far as they would go. And it was not adequate in any practical sense, but it was the gesture of a woman who, when faced with the inadequacy of available warmth, offers what she has. I said, "When I see Papa, I will tell him you said hello." She made a sound that was not quite a word. She pressed her lips together. I said, "Tell me about when I was born." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was August, very hot. The hospital was not air-conditioned, which was something your father complained about constantly, and which I found amusing because I was the one having the baby. You came out at 11 in the morning. You were very small. Your father cried, which he would have been embarrassed to admit, and which I thought was the most wonderful thing. I said, "He cried." She said he sat in the corner of the room with you in his arms and cried for about 10 minutes. I did not tell him I could see him. Some things are private. I smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that comes when something is both funny and dear. She said you were the happiest thing, not that you were easy. You were very particular from the beginning, very clear about what you wanted and very unhappy when you did not get it. But you were ours, and that was everything. The cold came through my coat. She held me closer. I said, "Maman, I am not afraid. I want you to know that." She said, "I know." I said, "I am sorry to leave you like this, with the wrong order." She said, "You did not choose the order. You chose everything else. You chose to love, you chose to give, you chose to be graceful when you did not have to be. Those are yours. Those are yours. And I am proud of every one of them." The tears came, which I had been managing but could not continue to manage in the face of that. I let them come. She held me in the hospital garden in the January cold, And they came, and they were not the tears of someone who is afraid, but the tears of someone who is full of the 10 years and the 15 days, and the love and the loss and the specific and irreplaceable warmth of her mother's arms. Part 9, the message. On day 2, I went through my phone. This is a practical thing that people who are dying do, the digital equivalent of putting affairs in order. I deleted accounts and cleared storage and wrote down passwords for Margot and made the specific administrative decisions that ensure no one has to do them later. It took most of the afternoon, and it was in a strange way satisfying. The way that completing a task is always satisfying, regardless of what the task is. I found in my drafts folder the message I had written to Lucien in the bridal shop on the Rue de la République, the one I had taken the photograph with and never sent. I had typed it and saved it as a draft and gone back to it 3 times without sending it. The message said, "I am in a wedding dress. I know this is strange. I wanted you to know that I was beautiful today, and that I have been beautiful for 10 years even though you did not see it, and that I hope someone sees you the way you deserve to be seen, and that you see them back the same way." I read it 4 times. Then I deleted the photograph from the draft and sent the words. He replied within 3 minutes. The reply said, "I see you now." I put the phone face down on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I am not going to tell you what I felt in response to those words. The feeling was mine, and it was specific, and it contained everything that 10 years of a particular love contains. When it reaches the end of its time, the good things and the painful things and the long patience and the grief of the finally understood, I am keeping it. I picked up the phone and sent one more message. It said, "I know, I am glad. Be well, Lucien." Then I put the phone down and went to sleep. Part 10, Day 1. The last day was a Tuesday. The snow had been falling since the previous evening, the specific heavy lion snow of deep January that moves slowly and settles thickly on every surface and muffles the city sounds. From my window in my mother's house, I could see the rooftops going white and the river in the distance moving grey and unhurried under the January sky. I was not able to see clearly by day 1. The deterioration had been gradual and then less gradual. And now the world was a specific quality of blur, not dark exactly, but with the edges gone, everything impressionistic and soft. The way you see the world when your eyes fill with tears, except that the tears were not the cause. I could hear, though, everything with extraordinary clarity. The snow falling which has no sound but which makes the world quieter in ways I could hear as the difference. Margot's voice when she came in, my mother's footsteps, which I have known since I was very small, the specific rhythm of her, the particular weight she places on the balls of her feet. She sat on the bed beside me. Margot was in the chair. I said, "Tell me something." My mother said, "What would you like to hear?" I said, "Something true." She thought for a moment, then she said, "You made my life larger. That is the most honest thing I know. Before you, my life was mine. After you, it became something that contained you, and a thing that contains love is always larger than a thing that does not." I said, "That is a good true thing." Margot said, "My true thing is that you are the bravest person I know, not because of the illness, because of the 10 years and what you did with them. You loved something that could not love you back the same way, and you did it without becoming smaller. That is the bravest thing." I said I did become smaller. She said, "At the end, you became smaller, but you were very large for a very long time." The snow, my mother's hand on mine, the world soft and impressionistic at the edges. I said, "I want to say something before I cannot say things." They were quiet. I said, "I do not regret loving him. I want you to know that. I regret some of the things I sacrificed for it, and I regret the time I spent waiting for something that was not going to come. But the loving itself, I do not regret. It was mine, it was real. And the things that are real belong to you permanently, even the ones that end." My mother said yes. Margot said yes. I said, "I am glad I was here. I am glad I had this specific life with its specific people and its specific city." The snow, my mother's hand, the soft world. The number in my head counted down to the last second, unhurried and precise. I counted with it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then I stopped counting because the counting was no longer mine to do. Part 11, What Lucien Found. This is the part of the story that is not told by Elise, because Elise is no longer here to tell it. I am telling it because someone should, because it is part of the whole picture, and because the whole picture is what the truth requires. Lucien Vidal came to the hospital on the day after day 1. He did not know it was day 1 until after. He had come because a mutual friend, a woman who worked with Margot, had called him without being asked to, motivated by the specific moral instinct of someone who believes that a person should not receive this kind of news without warning. He arrived to find Margot in the corridor. She told him. He stood in the hospital corridor with Margot's words settling around him, and his face did what faces do when they receive the thing they have not prepared to receive. He went to the room. Adeline was there. She looked at him without hostility and without welcome. She was beyond those things. He asked if he could sit for a moment. She said yes. He sat in the chair that Margot had been using. He looked at the empty bed, which is one of the most particular and terrible things. A person can look at a bed that has recently been occupied by someone and is now simply a bed. He asked Adeline how long. She told him. She said the word October and watched his face do what it did when it received the word October. She told him about Dr. Lebrun, the scans, the 15 days, the specific and deliberate architecture of his wife's final weeks, which had been managed with the precision and grace of someone who had been good at managing things for 10 years and had decided to spend the last 15 managing only the things that were truly hers. He did not cry in the room. He held himself with the specific controlled stillness that was characteristic of him, and Adeline looked at him, holding himself together, and thought with the specific and complex feeling of a mother whose daughter has been loved insufficiently, that he was finally now paying the full cost of the years he had been absent. He went through the house afterward, the Civil Affairs Office, having released Elise's personal effects to Adeline, and among them he found the wedding dress photographs. Adeline had given them to him because Elise had not said not to, and because Adeline understood from the message that Elise had shown her on day 2 that Lucien was supposed to have them. He held the photographs for a long time. She was beautiful in them. The dress moved around her in the way of something chosen correctly. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has been beautiful for a long time and has finally been told so, not by someone else, but by herself, which is the harder and more durable knowledge. He kept the photographs. He kept them in the inside pocket of his jacket for months, which Margot knows because Margot knows everything, and because she has become, in the months since, a person Lucien speaks to occasionally, not often, but enough. She does not comfort him, which he has not asked for. She tells him the truth about things, which he has asked for and which she delivers with the specific directness of someone who was Elise's best friend and has decided to carry that forward in the form of honesty. She told him once she did not regret loving you. I am telling you this not to comfort you, but because it is true, and because she would want you to know the truth. He said, how can she not have regretted it? Margot said, because she was that kind of person, the kind who loved genuinely and did not make the loving conditional on being loved back the same way. He said, I did not deserve it. Margot said, no, but she did not give it because you deserved it. She gave it because she had it. He sat with this for a long time. He is still sitting with it. Epilogue, the photographs. This is the last thing. In May, when Lyon is warm and the Quai de Sayone smells of flowers from the Saturday market, Adeline walks to the river sometimes. She is 63 and she walks well, and she carries when she walks a small print of the wedding dress photograph in the inside pocket of her coat, which is where she keeps things she is not ready to be without. She walks to the bridge and she looks at the river and she talks to Elise the way that people talk to the people they have lost quietly, and without expecting an answer, and with the specific intimacy of someone who knows that the conversation continues regardless of whether it can be received. She says the jasmine in the courtyard is blooming, You always loved the jasmine. She says Margot called yesterday. She is well. Her nephew is 5 now and still responds to every question with a question. She says I am all right. I want you to know that I am all right. I miss you in the specific way that a body misses a part of itself that was not peripheral. But I am here and I am walking, and the jasmine is blooming, and the river is doing what it does. She looks at the river. She says, you are the happiest thing, even the hard years, even the 15 days. You are the happiest thing, and I would do all of it again. The river moves, the May light on the water. A woman standing on a bridge in Lyon with a photograph in her pocket. The conversation that continues. That is all. That is everything. And 15 Days is an original dramatic narrative set in Lyon, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or to actual organizations or events is entirely coincidental. Additional chapter, Day 12. Day 12 was the day I told my mother. I had been preparing for the conversation for 4 days, which is not a long time and also an eternity. I had been turning it over in my mind with the specific quality of attention that I give to things I know I have to do, and am not ready to do the kind that goes over the same material repeatedly, without resolving anything but cannot be stopped. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived at her house. She was making something with apples, the dessert she makes in winter, with brown sugar and cinnamon that she has made for as long as I can remember, that smells of every winter of my childhood. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment before she heard me. She said without turning, "There is coffee on the stove." I poured a cup and sat at the table. She finished what she was doing with the apples and washed her hands and turned around and looked at me. She looked at me in the way she has always looked at me, completely, and without softening the look that sees the full thing. She said, "Tell me." I said, "Mama." She said, "I know something is wrong. I have known since October. Tell me." I told her. She sat across from me at the table where I have been sitting my entire life, and I told her everything Dr. Lebrun had told me in the same direct and efficient language he had used, because I had decided that the direct version was the only one I was capable of delivering. I told her about the scans and the progression and the timeline. She listened. Her face did not collapse. I had been afraid that her face would collapse, and it did not. It did the thing that my mother's face does when it receives something very difficult, which is to become very still and very clear, the stillness of someone who is doing internal work, rapidly and silently, and who is not going to let the work become visible until it is done. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying this alone?" I said, "Since October." She said, 2 months. I said I did not know how to say it. She said, "There is no how. There is only the saying. You could have said it to me in October, and I would have been here in October." I said, "I know, I am sorry." She said, "Do not apologize. Just let me be here now." She stood up and came around the table and put her arms around me from behind, in the standing embrace that is the one she uses when she is serious, and she held on. I said, "Maman, are you afraid?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Me too, sometimes." She said, "That is right. Being afraid is allowed." We stood in the kitchen for a while in that embrace. The apple dessert was in the oven. The lion Winter was outside doing its particular work. My mother's arms were exactly the arms of every difficult moment I have ever had, solid and specific, and unequivocally mine. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to stay here for the time I have left. I need to be in this house." She said, "Of course." I said, "And I need you to not tell Lucian." She was quiet. She said, "You are sure about this?" I said, "Yes." She said, "All right." No argument, no pushback. She had an opinion, I could feel it, the specific quality of a held opinion. But she held it because I had asked her to, because she understood that what was mine, and what I chose to do with it was my choosing. That is who my mother is. That is the person she has been for 34 years and the person she was in the 15 days. I am putting it on record because it deserves to be. Additional chapter, Camille Laurent. I want to tell you what I know about Camille Laurent because the incomplete account leaves her as a figure in the story without dimensions, which is not fair to anyone. She is 31 years old. She grew up in Bordeaux and came to Lyon 4 years ago for work. She is by every account I have good at what she does, which is property consultation. She is practical and efficient, and she has the specific quality of someone who has always known what she wanted and pursued it without apology. What she wanted at some point in the previous 6 months was Lucien. Whether this began as a professional interest that became something else or was always something else, I do not know and did not seek to know. What I know is that it existed and that it occupied in Lucien's attention the space that should have been occupied differently, and that this is not primarily her fault. She knew he was married. I believe she understood at some level that the marriage was a complicated one. Whether she understood the full picture of what she was entering, I cannot say. I do not hate her. This is the honest account. I thought I would or should, and I do not. What she represented to me was not a person exactly, but a fact, the fact of where his attention had gone, the proof of the years of absence in its most specific form. But she did not create the absence. She was the place the absence went when it needed somewhere to go. I thought about writing to her in the days after the divorce. I thought about what I would say, and when I tried to compose it in my head, the letter kept arriving at the same conclusion, which was that there was nothing I wanted to say that she needed to hear, and nothing she could say that I needed to receive. And the letter was an impulse toward a form of communication that would not serve anything. I did not write. What I hope for her is what I hope for Lucien, which is simply that the life they build together, if they build it, is real, that the attention is present, that neither of them disappears from the other in the specific incremental way that attention withdraws over time when it is not maintained, that they see each other clearly and keep looking. Whether this happens, I will not know. It is the thing that happens after the 15 days, in the time that is not mine to observe. I am at peace with this. Additional chapter, Margot. I want to stay with Margot for one more chapter, because the story I have told has her in the edges, when she should be more fully in the center. She arrived on day 15 with the specific, urgent competence of someone who has decided that the situation requires them, and who has organized themselves accordingly. She had told her supervisor at the hospital that she had a family emergency, which was the correct word for it, even if the relationship was friendship rather than family, because the distinction between the two had always been purely technical in our case. She knew how to be in a sick room. This is not a small thing. Most people do not know how to be in a sick room because most people have not spent years of their professional lives in them, and have not learned that the being in is a specific skill, different from ordinary presence, requiring the ability to hold the space without filling it, to offer without imposing, to be useful without making the usefulness into a performance of care. Margot knew these things. She did them without calling attention to the doing. She managed the practical details of the 15 days with a precision that I could not have managed myself. She communicated with Dr. Lebrun. She coordinated with my mother. She handled the specific administrative realities that follow a death, and that no one wants to think about in advance, but that must be thought about in advance, if the person who comes after is not to be overwhelmed by them. And she sat with me. In the evenings when my mother had gone to bed and the house was quiet, she sat with me in the room and we talked. Not about the illness, about everything else, about the gallery we had gone to together in Montpellier the previous spring that we had both found more interesting than expected, about a film she had seen that I had not, about her nephew and the phase he was going through, about the fabric merchant we sometimes bought from on the Saturday market, and whether he was actually Breton or had simply cultivated the persona because it sold better. We talked about ordinary things with the extraordinary attention of two people who understand that ordinary things are the substance of a life and are worth attending to completely. She said to me on one of those evenings, I am angry. I said, at what? She said, at the timing, at the specific cruelty of the timing of all of this. 10 years with someone who does not see you, and then 15 days. I said, the timing is just the timing. It is not directed. She said, I know it is not directed. I am still angry at it. I said, that is allowed. She said, you are too calm. I said, I have been calm my whole life. It is the one thing I was always good at. She said, you were good at many things. You were good at loving people. You were good at making things. You were good at understanding what a room needed and giving it that. I said, those are smaller things. She said, they are not smaller. They are the whole of it. The loving and the making and the paying attention, that is what a life is made of, and you did all of it. I looked at her, my oldest friend, the person who has known me longest, and most completely sitting in the chair in my mother's spare room in the January dark. I said, thank you for being here. She said, there is nowhere else I would be. I said, I mean for all of it, for 23 years of it. She said, you do not thank someone for that. You just have it. I said, I know, but I am thanking you anyway. She held my hand. We sat in the dark, and the snow fell outside, and the city was quiet. And the 15 days were counting down, and we were here, both of us in this specific room, which is where we needed to be. Additional chapter, the things I made. I was a graphic designer. I want to tell you about this because it is the part of my life that belonged most completely to me, the work I did for its own sake, and for the sake of what it produced. And because the things I made exist in the world still even now, and that is its own form of continuation. I specialized in identity design, the specific work of helping organizations understand themselves visually. What is your essential quality? What does the space between your words look like? What color is your particular form of reliability or warmth or precision? These are not simple questions, and they require a specific kind of attention. The attention that looks at a thing until the thing reveals itself, rather than the attention that imposes a predetermined reading. I had clients I was proud of. A music school in the 3rd arrondissement, whose logo I redesigned so that it communicated both the precision of practice and the expressiveness of performance in the relationship between two marks. A thing I had spent 3 weeks arriving at, and that when I arrived at it felt like finding something that was already there. A cooperative bakery in the 7th, whose visual identity I built around the specific quality of their bread, which was honest and unfussy and made from the simplest possible ingredients in the most careful possible way, and which I translated into a system of marks and colours that said the same things without words. I made a book once for a small Leon publisher, a limited edition collection of essays about the relationship between rivers and cities. And for this book, I designed every element, the typography and the margins, and the treatment of the images and the specific quality of the paper. And when the book arrived from the printer and I held it and opened it and felt the weight of it and read the first page, I understood what it means to make something well, not in the abstract, in the specific, physical, immediate way. These things continue. The music school has its logo. The bakery has its identity. The book is in libraries. The work I did is still in the world, doing what I made it to do, which is to help people understand something more clearly. This is, I think, enough. This is the form of continuation that is available to the things we make, and it is real and it is mine. I thought about this in the last days, about what continues and what does not. The love I gave to Lucian does not continue in the same way because he did not receive it in a form that could be carried. But the love I gave to Margot and to my mother and to the work continues in the specific form that received love takes, which is the form of the people who received it and who carry it forward in the particular quality of their own attention. This is the only kind of immortality I believe in, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that is the consequence of having paid genuine attention to things and people and the work of your hands, and of having been genuinely attended to in return. I was attended to. I gave attention. That is the whole of a life when you reduce it to its essential components. That is enough. Additional chapter, the last winter before. This is a chapter I almost did not write, because it belongs to a time before the 15 days, before the number, before the knowledge. It belongs to the winter before which was ordinary, in the way that the winters before catastrophe are ordinary, which is to say completely. That winter, the winter before the final one, I was working on a project for a hotel in the Presque Isle district that was renovating and wanted to rethink its visual identity. I was making things and they were going well. I had a period of 6 weeks in which the work was the specific quality of good work that makes itself, where one decision leads to the next with a logic that feels discovered rather than constructed. I had lunch with Margot in November. She came down from Grenoble for the weekend and we went to the brasserie on the quay where we have been going since we were 22, and we ate the same things we always eat and talked about the same mix of important and unimportant things that we always talk about. She told me about a patient she was worried about, a small boy who reminded her of her nephew. I told her about the hotel project, and she listened with the quality she always brings, genuinely interested. Walking back from the brasserie along the quay, I stopped for a moment because the light on the river was the specific quality of November light on the Rhone, low and golden, and moving quickly across the surface of the water, the light that lasts only a few minutes before it becomes something else. And I wanted to look at it for those few minutes. Margot stood beside me and looked at it too. She said, "Beautiful." I said, "Yes." We stood in the November light on the Quai de Seine and looked at the river doing what rivers do, which is to continue, and the light doing what it does, which is to be exactly itself for as long as it can be. I did not know yet about the number. I did not know about the hospital or Dr. Lebrun or the scans or the 15 days. I knew only what I knew, which was the ordinary contents of a day in November lunch with my oldest friend and the hotel project going well and the light on the river. It was enough. That afternoon was completely enough. I carry it now as one of the clearest things. The afternoon before the knowledge, when everything was simply what it was and I was simply in it and the light was the light it was. That is what I hope for the people I leave, not the dramatic things, the ordinary ones, the lunch with a friend and the light on a river, and the specific quality of a November afternoon that is exactly itself and asks nothing more of you than to be present in it. Be present in it. That is all. Additional chapter day 9. Day 9 was the day the headache became something different. It had been building since day 11, the specific kind of pain that Dr. Lebrun had described as a consequence of the progression, the pressure of what was happening inside the skull, on the structures that process sensation and make the world legible. I had been managing it with medication that reduced it without eliminating it, which is the best available outcome in this kind of situation. On day 9, I woke up, and the world had changed its quality. Not dark, not yet, but the edges of things were softer than they had been, the specific softening that Dr. Lebrun had warned me about, the beginning of the visual changes that would arrive before the end. I lay in the bed in my mother's spare room and looked at the ceiling and thought, this is what it is. Margot came in at 8 with coffee. She sat in the chair and looked at me and said, "How bad?" I said, "Not terrible, different." She said, "The vision." I said, "The edges of things." She nodded. She had known this was coming. She had the specific readiness of someone who works in medicine and who has therefore understood the trajectory of the thing from the beginning in a clinical sense, while also experiencing it in the personal sense, which is a specific and difficult double knowledge. I said, "Tell me something from outside." She said, "It snowed again last night. 3 centimeters, the city is white." I said, "What kind of white?" She said, "The clean kind, the kind that has not been walked on yet. It is early and the streets are quiet, and everything is the specific white of something that has not been complicated yet." I said, "I love that kind of white." She said, "I know." I said, "I think I would like to go outside later." "If I can." She said, "We will see." We did go outside later. Margot and I and my mother, who came with us. The 3 of us walking slowly along the street in front of the house in the clean white that had not been complicated yet. I could see enough to see the white, which was the important thing. The blur at the edges did not take the white. We walked for 30 minutes. My mother held my left arm and Margot held my right, and we walked in the white and the cold and the specific January quiet of a city still in its early morning, and I breathed the cold air and felt it move through me and thought, this is what it is to be here. I am still here. That is the thing I want to say about day 9, that despite everything I was still here, still breathing the cold air and looking at the uncomplicated white and being held by the 2 people I love most in the world, still inside the ordinary miracle of a January morning in Lyon. The number was counting down. The numbers always count down. That is what numbers do. But the morning was the morning regardless, and the morning was enough. Additional chapter, What Remains. A note from Margot written 3 months after Elise died. I have been asked by the solicitor handling Elise's estate to write something for the collection of her papers that will eventually be donated to the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, where she trained along with her design work and her professional records. I am not a writer. I am a pediatric nurse from Grenoble, and the only qualification I have for this task is that I loved her and knew her and was there. What I want to say about Elise Arnaud is that she was the specific kind of person who made the world around her more organized and more beautiful, without anyone noticing exactly how it was done, which is the quality of the best design and also the quality of the best friendship and the best love. The organization and the beauty were simply there arrived at through her particular attention, and the people who benefited from them generally did not stop to examine the mechanism. I stopped to examine it over 23 years, and what I found was a person of extraordinary and consistent integrity. She did not do easy things instead of hard things. She did not choose the comfortable reading when the accurate reading was more demanding. She did not manage her feelings into a smaller and more convenient shape. She had them completely, and she carried them with the specific grace of someone who has never learned to pretend they weigh less than they do. She loved Lucien Vidal for 10 years, and it was not returned in the way she gave it. And she continued anyway, not from weakness, but from the genuine conviction that the love itself had value, regardless of its reception. I did not always understand this choice. I argued with it sometimes in the way that friends argue with the choices of people they love when they find those choices costly. She heard my arguments and thanked me for them and continued. In the 15 days, she did not ask for anything she was not entitled to. She did not demand recognition or reconciliation or the specific forms of closure that people often seek. She organized her affairs with precision and grace. She spent the time with the people she loved in the form of ordinary days, coffee and conversation and walks in the snow in the specific domestic warmth of her mother's house. She said to me once in the last week that the thing she was most proud of was that she had never stopped paying attention to the work, to the people she loved, to the specific quality of light on the river on an ordinary afternoon. I am writing this 3 months after she died, and I am still paying attention to the things she would have paid attention to, which is the form of continuation she left me, the form that does not diminish. The jasmine in my courtyard bloomed in April. I told her, Margot Lemaire, April.